Hello, Dr. Ken here with a special Halloween edition of Roman history, just for my Roman history class, but anyone who wishes is welcome to watch. And you may be all pleased to know that through the dark magic of digital technology, I have found a way to put images onto the screen while I'm talking, so you don't have to just stare at me. There. So our topic today is going to be Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great as he's known. We were introduced to him briefly last time during the period of crisis that took place following the Gracchi brothers and the reforms of Gaius Marius. This time we're going to focus on Pompey Magnus himself, and for the next several lessons we'll be doing a kind of overlapping or multiple passes of roughly the same period in history, because it's a very momentous one, and we're going to get it from multiple angles and perspectives. So to remind you, of course, Pompey was involved in the affairs of Sulla during his civil war. He's originally from a native Roman family, moderately successful in making inroads into the Senate. His father, we'll recall him, Pompey Strabo, had been consul, and he was an accomplished general who fought in the Marsic Wars as part of the Italian Social Wars. He was also nicknamed the Butcher of Asculum for his particularly brutal treatment of the town of Asculum when it refused to surrender. By the age of 17, Pompey was an active participant in his father's campaigns and busily building up his own military career. He rose to prominence most famously serving Sulla, well, not famously, but most in his early career at any rate, most significantly serving Sulla in the first major Roman civil war, defeating the forces of Marius in Africa. And we'll recall that Pompey got his army to support Sulla through illegal means, that is, through going around finding his father's veterans and pardon me, and asking them to join him. So he gets his military command without legitimate sanction, officially sanctioned means. Sulla doesn't mind. He's grateful for the help, and that's sort of not really the start of his career, but it certainly propels his career to new heights. After Sulla, and despite having no experience as a Roman magistrate, he somehow managed to coerce command in Spain against a rebel general named Quintus Sertorius, and this was simply through the fear of his legions. So Pompey, taking a page from Marius and Sulla's playbook, is using his legions to intimidate himself or intimidate others into giving him political positions. The war wasn't exactly a clear-cut victory for Pompey. But Sertorius gets murdered, and Pompey returns to Rome in triumph. And an interesting aspect of his career worth mentioning is a tendency for taking advantage of situations, and also just quite a bit of luck as well, it seems. When he returns from Spain, Pompey helps to mop up the war with the gladiator general Spartacus, and this is a mopping up action because Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, had already been involved in putting down the gladiator revolt. Pompey will claim much of the credit, which doesn't earn him friendship from Crassus. He did, but like I say, Crassus had conducted the bulk of the operation, so a dangerous rivalry develops between these two men. Both, however, were elected consul for the year 70 BC. And they worked together repealing the bulk of Sulla's constitutional reforms, but otherwise apparently had very little use for each other. Pompey enjoyed considerable favoritism amongst the masses as well as the army. The senatorial class, however, deeply distrusted him. He seemed to be siding with the populares. Did he really side with them? No, he actually tried to walk a rather narrow middle ground. So he avoided openly siding with the Populares faction, and the Senate reluctantly tolerated him. The Optimates faction tolerated him, but didn't really trust him. By 67, the Senate and the people had had enough of dealing with Rome's old enemy Mithridates. Remember the Mithridatic War? Sulla had marched off to fight it, but then gets involved in the war with with Marius. Now it's still going on. Something needs to be done, and Pompey Magnus is sent off to deal with it. So a tribune named A. Gabinius passed a law transferring command of the Mithridatic campaign from the current consul Galabrio to Pompey. He was also granted unparalleled authority in defeating the Cilician pirates who had been taking advantage of Rome's occupation with other affairs to ravage the Mediterranean. I'll come back to that in a moment. So in 66 BC, despite fierce opposition amongst the Optimate faction, the Lex Manilia would be passed, which granted Pompey unlimited power in the eastern territories. Ironically enough, it was the oration of the lifelong Republican defender Marcus Tullius Cicero that pushed this proposal into law, and the support of Julius Caesar as well, it'll turn out. First, worth talking about Pompey and the war with the pirates. So before his appointment to go off and fight in the east, his initial problem is to deal with the pirates, the pirates that are ravaging the Mediterranean. These are mostly Cilicians from Cilicia, which is in Asia Minor. Wheat and other imports were skyrocketing, and Roman aristocrats were being captured and ransomed off by these pirates. They would actually sail up to the Bay of Baiae, the resort of the wealthy, capture Roman patricians, and then hold them hostage and demand payment for this. So it was becoming a problem, and the pirates were taking advantage of the fact that Rome was preoccupied with other affairs. Plutarch writes that 500 ships were manned and equipped for him, and an army was raised consisting of 120,000 legionaries and 5,000 cavalrymen. He was given complete charge of the Mediterranean, and with few exceptions, authority over 400 miles inland within Roman territory. His fleet was so large he had to split it into 13 naval legions. 60 ships would remain under his direct command. So he spreads these legions throughout the Mediterranean and has his own mobile command group that then, or task force, I suppose, that goes in and deals with larger matters. Pirate activity in the Western Mediterranean was virtually wiped out as a result of this. Now, again, Pompey had not come from, the Romans hadn't just started fighting the pirates with Pompey. There had been other commanders doing it as well. So again, he's kind of coming in, pardon me, a bit later in the game, and taking credit for all the work, although he's not done all the work. But again, what he did accomplish is, it's worth merit. This is what Plutarch writes about it in his biography. It says, "Now because Pompey had shown himself merciful to some of these pirates that were yet roving in bodies about the seas, having upon their supplication ordered a seizure of their ships and persons only, without any further process or severity. Therefore the rest of their comrades, in hopes of mercy too, made their escape from his other commanders, and surrendered themselves with their wives and children, into his protection. He continued to pardon all that came in, and the rather because by them he might make discovery of those who fled from justice." And so he's using multiple tactics. There are military tactics, but he's also using diplomacy to win over these pirates. And those that surrender get farms quite a few miles inland. They're not allowed to live near the sea anymore after this, but they will get farms further inland. He confiscated their ships and wealth, forced them, some 20,000 according to Plutarch, to be resettled into cities within Roman territory that had suffered depopulation, dividing them up so they wouldn't remain together as a group. With the sea secured, Pompey then turned inland towards Cilicia, which had been the base of the pirates, the sort of home territory. The pirate bases are eliminated. The former pirates, again, he moves further inland, turning them into farmers. In fact, the biggest threats on the Mediterranean after Pompey were rival Roman forces in the civil wars that would follow. So the Mediterranean now truly becomes what the Romans would call it, the Mare Nostrum, our sea. It is completely under Roman control, and will be probably for the next 4 centuries at least. Um, Pompey was now free to broaden his operations, and the piracy issue settled quickly. The tribune C. Manilius next proposed that Pompey take over the entire eastern campaign against Mithridates and others. Before the current commander Galabrio could even get started, Pompey was granted imperium, that's authority, official authority to command the entire east, and took over. In 66 BC, the final showdown with Mithridates was to begin. So Mithridates had been running amok as the Romans fought themselves. Now Pompey's going to go take care of him. He had been touring Greece after the Pirate War, and then when this law is passed, but another commander was already in charge of the war with Mithridates, and that was a man named Lucullus, whose progress seems to have stalled in all fairness, although again the groundwork was laid by Lucullus. Pompey was to retain his naval and other forces, as well as taking control of Lucullus's command, troops, and territories, along with the province of Bithynia. Plutarch seems a bit outraged by this, and perhaps quite rightly sees it as a foreshadowing of things to come. He writes, "But this was nothing less than to constitute one absolute monarch of all the Roman Empire. For the provinces which seemed to be exempt from his commission by the former decree, such as Phrygia, Laconia, Galatia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, and Upper Colchis, and Armenia, were all added by the later law, together with all the troops and forces with which Lucullus had been fighting Mithridates and Tigranes, his ally. And though Lucullus was thus simply robbed of the glory of his achievements in having a successor assigned him, rather to the honor of his triumph than the danger of the war, yet this was of less moment in the eyes of the aristocratic party, though they could not but admit the injustice and ingratitude to Lucullus. But their great grievance was that the power of Pompey should be converted into a manifest tyranny. And they therefore exhorted and encouraged one another privately to bend all their forces in opposition to this law, and not tamely to cast away their liberty." So this is when they're opposing the Manilian law. "Yet when the day came on which it was to pass into a decree, their hearts failed them for fear of the people, and all were silent except Catullus, who boldly inveighed against the law and its proprietor, and when he found that he could do nothing with the people, turned to the Senate, crying out and bidding them seek out some mountain, as their forebears had done, and fly to the rocks, where they might preserve their liberty. The law passed into a decree, as it is said, by the suffrage of the tribes, and Pompey, in his absence, was made lord of almost all that power which Sulla had only obtained by force of arms, after a conquest of the very city itself. When Pompey had advice by letters of this decree, it is said that in the presence of his friends who came to congratulate him for his honor, he seemed displeased, frowning and smiting his thigh, and exclaiming as one overburdened and weary of government, "Alas! Is there to be no end to my labors? It really is better to be born a nobody. Look at me. My military service will never cease, and I will never shake off the envy that haunts me, and live quietly with my wife in the countryside." But Plutarch adds that even his closest friends found the insincerity of these words abhorrent, because they knew that his dislike for Lucullus facilitated the innate ambitions and love of power, and made him all the more delighted with what had happened. So he's granted essentially full powers to make war and peace and to organize the whole of the Roman East. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that he's given powers like a monarch. Now, they are temporary, and he will eventually have to give them up. But for a time, he is the absolute ruler of the Roman East. Mithridates dies in 63. Pompey plans the consolidation of the eastern provinces for 6,000 talents. He sets up King Tigranes in Armenia as a friend and ally of Rome and as his own protege. So what does Pompey get up to in the east? Well, the Parthian king had requested that the Euphrates River be the limit of Roman control. Pompey rejects this. He extends the Roman chain of protectorates to include Colchis on the Black Sea and the states south of the Caucasus. In Anatolia, he creates the new province of Bithynia, Pontus, and Cilicia. He annexes Syria and leaves Judea as a dependent, although albeit diminished, temple state. The reorganization of the East remains Pompey's greatest achievement. He had a very sound appreciation of the geographical and political factors involved. This allowed him to impose an overall settlement that was to form the basis of the defensive frontier system that was to last with few important changes for more than 500 years. In 64, in Pontus, he begins reorganizing the newly won territories into provinces. Cilicia had already been officially made a province after his campaign against the pirates. He would continue his remarkable skills as an administrator in the additional conquered lands. Satisfied with his results in Pontus, Pompey moves on to Syria in late 64 BC. Syria was still technically part of the old Seleucid dynasty, descendants of the old Roman enemy Antiochus III, a successor of Alexander the Great. However, rivals all over the territory controlled various cities, and chaos reigned, so it wasn't a unified kingdom by any means. The vast wealth of the region was a tempting target for the Parthians and the neighboring Arabians, and Pompey wanted to stabilize it for Roman benefit. So Syria was simply annexed as a Roman province with little regard for the opposing factions within. They were removed from power, and Roman authority took control. As opposed to creating a client kingdom that would be unreliable, he chose to turn it into a province. And he didn't just add Syria, but created a buffer zone between potential eastern enemies and other newly won territories in that area that now encompasses modern Turkey. You can see this on the map fairly clearly, these different territories that he's divided up. So after affairs in Sicily, Judea next becomes a problem. They call upon Pompey for assistance in their own internal conflicts. The Jews had enjoyed nearly 2 centuries of independence from the Seleucids, again, those successors of Alexander who had taken over Jerusalem for a time. But the power struggle that was leading to civil war threatened their stability. And the notes tell you a bit more about this. Pardon me. Essentially, Pompey puts a king named Hyrcanus. He sides with this king, puts him on the throne. Judea is independent, but it owes its crown and its independence to Rome. So it becomes a kind of tribute-paying client kingdom, much like Armenia. And Rome will do this. They'll create client kingdoms as buffers in between. The client kingdoms, they're kind of like the federated allies in the old, in Italy back before Rome was much more of a centralized power. But in the case of Judea, it will have no foreign policy of its own. It'll be beholden to Rome. In 64 BC, Armenia invaded Parthian interest in Mesopotamia, and that could have had dire consequences in the region, but Pompey could have supported the invasion and taken direct involvement against Parthia, but after several exhaustive years on the move, he must have been tired or perhaps foresaw that it wouldn't be a good idea. Instead, he negotiates a peace between Armenia and Parthia, giving back most of Tigranes' gains, his allies' gains against the Parthians, but establishing peace in the region for at least another decade. Pompey would return to Rome to celebrate his third and most glorious triumph in late 62 BC. The wealth he brought back with him was nearly incalculable, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 40,000 gold talents. The annual income of Rome doubled as a result of both the war spoils and tributes from the client states. Back in Rome, though, there was concern over Pompey's return. Despite his success, he had nearly 45,000 men under his command and an incredible amount of money. So they're worried about another Sullan-type march on the city, or that perhaps he's going to use his military might to make himself dictator. He would receive unparalleled honors throughout the empire as well, and this was another cause for concern for the Romans. Honorific cult statues of Pompey were established in Delos at Athens, Philadelphia, and people consecrated him as Imperator. Again, that title that Scipio Africanus used to have. It means supreme commander, but again, it's the word that would be used in time to come to refer to Roman emperors. So he's worshipped as a divine hero in a number of places. A month was named after him at Mytilene. He was honored as the savior of Samos, as savior and founder after defeating the enemies of the world by land and sea at Mytilene, as savior and benefactor of all Asia, as guardian of the land and sea at Miletopolis. In the cities, there were cities named after him. Pompeiopolis probably struck coinage in his own lifetime with his face on it. Aristarchus of Colchis struck a coin with his portrait on it in 52 BC. And at least 4 cities other than Pompeiopolis used a Pompeian era calendar, each taking a moment during his presence in the East as the starting point for the new dating system. At least one moneyer in Rome had shown him as Triumphator, the triumphant, echoing portraits of Sulla with the same title. So you can perhaps understand why the Senate might be alarmed. They feared another Sullan march on the city, as I say, in a forced dictatorship. But Pompey wasn't the man to do that sort of thing. And I think this comes down to his basic psychology. And as I've said before in class, most of the people that we're looking at are psychopaths and narcissists. Pompey wanted approval. He wanted the approval of the conservative optimates faction within the Senate. He also wanted the approval of the people. And he seems to have instinctively realized the way to get this was not to become a dictator, not to follow Sulla's footsteps. So he was happy to return with all the power and grandeur of a conquering general. He assumed that his great success would ensure settlements for his men, a position of prominence in the Senate for himself. He found instead, upon returning, that Rome had changed. As much as the East had. New names had risen in his absence, such as a young Gaius Julius Caesar and Marcus Tullius Cicero, who would lay claim to being the savior of Rome in Pompey's absence. We'll be looking at that a bit more in time to come when we get to Cicero and Caesar. His prestige and power, Pompey's, were arguably at their height in December of 62 when he landed at Brundisium and dismissed his army. He had his 3rd triumph after that. The following decade was the period of his ascendancy in Italy, which was to be eroded through Caesar's growing military power and gradual capture of Pompey's worldwide clientele from the power base Caesar in turn created in northern Italy and Gaul. The Optimates faction still doesn't really support him, this inner ring of nobles, and they didn't like Crassus or Caesar either, who had tried to steal the limelight in Pompey's absence and maneuver into better positions for themselves. The nobles had gradually reasserted their dominance in Rome and hampered attempts to alleviate the condition of Italy and the Roman populace. So these old grievances that we've seen before with the Gracchi brothers are still there. The Optimates faction are doing their best to ensure that reforms are slow and don't take place very quickly, or stalled altogether. Pompey cautiously avoids siding with the popular elements again against the Optimates. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wanted everyone to recognize him as the best sort of first citizen, available for further large-scale military service if need be to the state. He had divorced his 3rd wife, Mucia, and now proposed to ally himself by marriage to the party of the young senatorial leader Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, arguably the leader of the Optimates faction. But the nobles were closing ranks against him, and another officer, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was determined to prevent the en bloc ratification of the Eastern settlement, and to reject the demand for land for citizens. So he doesn't get to marry into the aristocratic family, and his settlement in the East is going to be blocked in the Senate. Well, what to do? Well, these other politicians at the time, Crassus, you remember Crassus, who got his wealth and prosperity from Sulla, Julius Caesar, who is building up a power base now, they joined together with Pompey. And it's not just these three, but it's principally these three. In 60 BC, Caesar's decision to forego a chance at a triumph for his achievements in Spain, fighting against rebels in Spain, put him in a position to run for consul. But he faced considerable opposition. Caesar was a populares, and so the Optimates senators oppose him. Even though Caesar seemed to hold overwhelming popularity with the citizen assemblies, he had to manipulate formidable alliances within the Senate itself in order to secure his election. Caesar had already a friendship with Crassus, who was fabulously wealthy, probably the second richest man in Rome after Pompey himself. And so obviously someone good to be on your side. Caesar apparently owed Crassus quite a bit of money too for some of his election campaigns. So he approached Crassus's rival Pompey with the concept of an amicitia, which means coalition. Pompey had already been considerably frustrated by his inability to get land reform for his eastern veterans, and Caesar brilliantly patched up any differences between these two powerful leaders. Crassus, on the other hand, had significant assets tied up in the eastern interest as well, and was a great ally of the leading equestrian families and their business interests. Remember that the equestrians undertake most of the business in the empire. He needed a politician like Caesar to support him. So the first triumvirate, as it would be called, was a bit of a misleading name. It was never officially called that by contemporary Romans. This is a later title that we've given it. It means board of three-man board. It was a more inclusive faction, really. Many leading men were involved, such as Lucius Lucius, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, whose daughter Calpurnia Caesar later married. Cicero, due to his association with Pompey and relative influence, was likely to be asked to participate to forming this kind of majority-style government, but he refuses. Without Cicero, the alliance was formed in 60 BC and remarkably remained a secret for quite some time. Caesar won the election easily, though the Optimates managed to have his former co-idol Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus elected as the junior consul. We'll see that when we get to Caesar. Caesar so much dominated the consulate, even like having mobs of people surround Bibulus' house to make sure he didn't go out and go into the office. It's sometimes referred to as the consulate of Julius and Caesar. But we'll get to that next time. The first triumvirate was to become more than a mere election compact. It would strain all the resources of the triumvirs to wrest one single consulship from the Optimates, so their continued solidarity was essential if they were to secure what Caesar had gained for them in 59. Caesar, for his part, wanted a long-term command. Pompey, who had now married Caesar's daughter Julia, saw Caesar as his necessary instrument. Caesar, once consul, immediately forced through a land bill, and shortly after another appropriating lands in Campania. Once he had secured a 5-year military command in Illyria and Gaul, he could be relied on to take off a large proportion of Pompey's discharged troops and give them further opportunities for profitable employment. So Pompey solved his problem of Rome's grain supply as well, by securing supplies from the eastern territories, but the Optimates still kept up their opposition. In 56 BC was a critical year for the triumvirs. The nobles concocted religious impediments to prevent the dispatch of Pompey on a military mission to Egypt, while Publius Clodius Pulcher contrived to persuade Pompey that Crassus had designs on his life. An attempt was made to suspend Caesar's law for the distribution of land as well. So you can see, political forces within the government fighting back against even this triumvirate, which isn't all powerful. Crassus goes off to meet Caesar at Ravenna, and Caesar in turn came to the limit of his province at Lucca to meet Pompey. This is referred to as the Lucca Conference of 56. As people are trying to stir them up against each other, they come together, and it prepares the ground for the next phase of triumviral cooperation. Pompey and Crassus were to secure election for the consulship for 55 BC. They too wanted 5-year commands in the provinces, while Caesar's command was to be renewed for another 5 years. The three secured their ends by violence and corruption after a prolonged struggle. So a lot of bribery, a lot of mob violence in Rome itself, and this didn't reassure people at home or in the Senate, really. Caesar obtained the extension of his command, while Pompey and Crassus received commands in Spain and Syria, respectively. Pompey could stay on in Italy and govern his provinces by deputies, but the triumvirate was coming to an end. Julia, Caesar's daughter, dies in 54 BC. This destroyed the strongest bond between Pompey and Caesar, and Crassus then suffered a disastrous defeat and death in Mesopotamia. Crassus would famously march off to fight the Parthians and get killed, with his head being used as a prop in a play performance of the Bacchae by Euripides that the Parthians put on there. So they were very cultured, the Parthians. So with Crassus gone and Caesar, well, the Senate, the Optimates faction maneuvering Pompey against Caesar, we're going to end up in another civil war. Anarchy seems to be reigning in the city of Rome, and it's in no small part thanks to the political machinations of people like Caesar and Pompey and Crassus, but they're not the only ones. So there's mob violence. It was becoming daily intolerable, and the Senate, the Optimates faction, finds an alliance with Pompey to be unavoidable. He becomes the lesser of two evils. They're not going to side with Caesar. He is essentially their sworn enemy. Pompey they don't really like, but they feel they can use him. He refuses further offers from Caesar of a marriage alliance into his family. There was talk in 54 BC of a dictatorship for Pompey. Street violence made it impossible to hold the elections. In January of 52, Publius Clodius Pulcher is killed by armed followers of Titus Annius Milo, whose candidacy for the consulship was being bitterly opposed by both Pompey and Clodius. Now both factions exploded into even greater violence. The Senate House is burnt to the ground by the mob. With no senior magistrates in office, the Senate had to call on Pompey to restore order. It was the hour he had waited for. He speedily summoned troops from Italy. The nobles would not have him as dictator, but they thought it safer to appoint him as sole consul. Worth pointing out, this is unconstitutional. There are always meant to be two consuls, but for whatever reasons on this occasion they've decided one consul will be enough. So Pompey's legislation of 52 BC reveals both his genuine interest in reform and the duplicity of his conduct towards Caesar. He reformed procedure in the courts and produced a panel of respectable jurors. But a severe law against bribery at elections was made retroactive to 70 BC, and for all of Pompey's protest, it was clearly aimed at Caesar. Another useful law enforced a 5-year interval between tenure of magistracies in Rome and assumption of provincial commands. So by this law and another which prohibited candidature in absentia, this effectively destroyed the ground for Caesar's expectations that he should become designated consul and so be safe from prosecution. His war in Gaul is considered illegal, especially by the Optimates faction led by Cato in the Senate. They're going to prosecute Caesar for it. He wants to stay on as consul because, while he's consul, they can't prosecute him, and then he can pass laws making sure that what he did is legal. But they've outmaneuvered him. Several attempts were made in the years 51 to 50 BC to recall Caesar before the expiration of his second term in Gaul. They were frustrated by the assertiveness of Caesar's faction and his agents in Rome. So you've got to imagine multiple factions of individuals in Rome. Lobbying is not quite the right term, but exerting influence often through mob violence and bribery and blackmail and any other means at their disposal. All operating against one another to prevent some people from getting in power and to encourage others to get into power. Pompey, for all his growing fear and suspicion of Caesar's ambitions, did not come out openly against him until late 51 BC. He declared that he would not consider the suggestion that Caesar should become designated consul while still in command of his army. His proposals for a compromise date for Caesar's recall were unacceptable to Caesar, whose sole resource now was to use the wealth that he had accumulated in Gaul to buy more men who could obstruct his enemies in the Senate. When war came, the Senate was solidly for Pompey, though they saw him simply as the lesser of two evils, as I mentioned. Late in 50 BC, the consul Gaius Marcellus, failing to induce the Senate to declare Caesar a public enemy, visited Pompey with the consul's designate and placed a sword in his hand. He accepted their invitation to raise an army and defend the state. Caesar continued to offer compromise solutions while preparing to strike. On 7th of January 49 BC, the Senate finally decreed a state of war. 4 days later, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, which was the boundary of his territory, and amounted to civil war. Pompey's plan, his strategic plan, was to abandon Rome and Italy to Caesar and rely on his command of the sea and resources in the east to starve out the Caesarians in Italy. That might seem like a bad move. However, he couldn't defend Rome. He didn't have enough troops there at the time. He couldn't get them together quickly enough. Caesar makes a lightning march into Italy, and all of northern Italy essentially falls to Caesar at that point. So leaving Rome is probably the only thing Pompey could do. He and the members of the Senate, the Optimatus faction who support him, go. They don't like it. They're critical of Pompey's decision. They'd rather stay and fight, but there's an awareness, I think, that if they did stay and fight, they would have been defeated. So, as I say, he didn't have, well, unfortunately for Pompey, he also didn't have the discipline, loyalty, and full cooperation of his own allies, and Caesar's swift advance southward only just failed to prevent his withdrawal from Italy. Across the Adriatic at Dyrrhachium, the wisdom of his strategy becomes clear. Caesar, after a hazardous crossing in pursuit, found himself cut off from his base in Italy by sea and facing superior land forces. Pompey, however, eventually had to abandon his naval blockade of the rest of Caesar's forces at Brundisium and failed to prevent their crossing to join Caesar. Caesar's army was repulsed in an assault on Pompey's camp at Dyrrhachium, and failing a quick decision in the west, Caesar was obliged to move eastwards into Thessaly. Pompey followed and joined forces with the Senate's army there under Scipio, rendering Caesar's position untenable. But Pompey came under pressure from his Optimate allies. They wanted a battle. So a sensible enough decision, if his opponent had not perhaps been a military genius. Julius Caesar writes almost matter-of-factly about his victory over Pompey in the Civil War. And this is the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC in Greece. A battle that, had it been any other commander, quite possibly Pompey would have won. But I'll give you Caesar's description of it. So he says, and he speaks of himself in the third person here, in his Civil War. He writes, "At the same time, Caesar gave the order to advance to the third line, which had done nothing and had stayed in its position up till then. As a result, when fresh and unscathed troops took the place of the weary, while others were attacking from the rear, the Pompeians could not hold out, and every one of them turned tail and fled. Caesar was not wrong in thinking that the victory would originate from those cohorts which had been stationed in the fourth line to counteract the cavalry, as he had declared when he was cheering on his men. For it was by these first the cavalry were repulsed, it was by these that the slingers and archers were massacred, and it was by these that the Pompeian left wing was surrounded and a rout started. When Pompey, however, saw his cavalry routed and observed the very part of his forces on which he most relied now in a state of panic, having no confidence in the rest, he left the field. The Pompeians were driven back in their retreat inside the ramparts. Caesar, thinking that they should not be given respite in their panic, urged his men to take advantage of fortune's generosity and storm the camp. When our men were already inside the rampart, Pompey got a horse, removed his general's insignia, rushed out of the camp by the rear gate, and galloped off to Larissa. He did not stop there, but with a few of his men, whom he picked up in his flight, he went on through the night without stopping, accompanied by 30 cavalrymen, until he reached the sea. There he embarked on a grain ship, with, it is said, frequent lamentations that he should have been so grossly mistaken, that he appeared almost to have forgotten, to have been betrayed by the very men whom he had hoped would secure victory, but who had in fact started the flight. So Pompey suffered a disastrous defeat on the plain of Pharsalus in 48 BC. It looks like, from what I understand of these things, Pompey was going to use a tactic developed by Alexander the Great, actually developed by Philip of Macedon, called the hammer and anvil, where a heavy cavalry force is used to basically to slam into the enemy army and ideally take out their commander or their key forces. Caesar anticipated this, knowing Pompey's tactics, and countered it very effectively, driving back the very forces that Pompey had hoped to use to win. Plutarch writes of Pompey's reaction afterwards. He says, "It is difficult to say what thoughts went through Pompey's mind when he saw the dust cloud raised by the fugitives and guessed what had happened to his cavalry. But he behaved like someone who had been driven insane and had taken leave of his senses. It was as if he had no conception that he was Pompey the Great. Without saying a word to anyone, he walked slowly back to his camp, returned to his tent, and sat there speechless, until large numbers of Caesar's men burst into the camp, hot on the heels of the fugitives. And when he spoke a single sentence, no more, he said, 'So are even my quarters under attack?' Without further word, he got to his feet, gathered together the kind of clothing that would suit his circumstances, and stole away. The rest of his legion also fled. There was considerable slaughter in the camp of attendants and slaves." So he fled from the camp as the enemy stormed it and made his way to the coast, as Caesar said. His supporters were to rally and involve Caesar in strenuous fighting in Africa and Spain in the east for 3 more years. But Pompey did not live to play a part in this struggle. It would be his son Sextus Pompeius who would lead. He decided to land at Pelusium in Egypt and to seek the assistance of Ptolemy the 13th, his former client. He had been instrumental, Pompey, in putting Ptolemy the 12th on the throne, and he expected the king, son of his ally and current client, to be friendly to him. The king marched down to the coast, ostensibly to welcome him, but he and his counselors had chosen not to risk offending the victorious Caesar. Pompey's small squadron lay offshore, while Pompey, bidding farewell to his wife Cornelia, complied with the invitation to enter with several companions a small boat sent to bring him to the land. As he prepared to step ashore, he was treacherously struck down and killed. His fate was sealed by the counselors of the young king. While Pompey waited offshore, they had argued around the cost of offering him refuge, with Caesar already en route to Egypt, which they knew. The king's eunuch Pothinus won out. In the final dramatic passage of his biography, Plutarch has Cornelia watch anxiously from the trireme as Pompey left in a small boat with a few sullen, silent comrades, headed for what appeared to be a welcoming party on the Egyptian shore. As he rose to disembark, he was stabbed to death by his betrayer, Archelaus, and a Roman soldier as well named Septimius and Salvius. These were troops who were stationed there to defend the king, and sent there by Pompey himself some time ago, but now they're betraying him. Plutarch has him meet his fate with great dignity. Just one day after his 59th birthday, his body remains on the shoreline to be cremated by his local freeman Philip on the rotten planks of a fishing boat. His head and his seal were presented to Caesar, who, according to Plutarch, mourned this insult to the greatness of his former ally and former son-in-law as well, and punished his assassins and their Egyptian co-conspirators, putting both Archelaus and Pothinus to death. Pompey's ashes were eventually returned to Cornelia, who carried them to his country house near Alba. Cassius Dio describes Caesar's reactions with skepticism and considers Pompey's own political misjudgments rather than treachery as instrumental in his downfall. In Appian's account of the civil war, Caesar has Pompey's severed head interred in Alexandria, in ground preserved for a new temple to the goddess Nemesis, whose divine functions include the punishment of hubris. For Pliny the Elder, the humiliation of Pompey's end is anticipated by the vaunting pride of his oversized portrait head, studded entirely with pearls and carried in a procession during his greatest triumph. Caesar was supposedly outraged when he saw the head of Pompey Magnus. This was a Roman consul. How could a Roman consul be treated by these Egyptian barbarians? Well, what was that an exaggeration? It's hard to say. He might have been quite happy that Pompey was now no longer a problem, or he might have been truly upset. He might have been hoping that he could bring him back and keep him as a friend. We don't know. Caesar writes of Pompey's arrival in Egypt and murder at the hands of the boy king's soldiers with an almost apologetic tone. He says, "Then the favorites of the king, who were administering the kingdom for him on account of his youth, learned this, either, as they later alleged, swayed by the fear that Pompey might suborn the royal army and seize Alexandria and Egypt, or from contempt of him in his misfortune, Caesar adds in parentheses, it is usually the case that friends become enemies in times of adversity. They gave, to all appearances, a generous response to his envoys who he had sent and bade him come to the king. But they themselves conferred together secretly, and then sent Archelaus, an officer of the king and a man of singular audacity, along with Lucius Septimius, a military tribune, to kill Pompey. Pompey was addressed by them courteously, and was induced to approach by some acquaintance with Septimius, who had led a sentry under him in the war against the pirates. So he boarded a little boat and with a few of his companions, and there he was killed by Archelaus and Septimius. There's some lovely lines of poetry from the poet Lucan in his Civil War about Pompey's death, and I put that in the notes. How do we assess Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus? Well, his name casts a long shadow. In the empire, he acquired official respectability, and the greatness of his achievements was fully appreciated by the great writers. But there are few clear-headed or unbiased accounts of Pompey by his own contemporaries. Caesar would have his readers believe that he wrote of Pompey more in sorrow than in anger. His propaganda was discreet and subtly damaging to his rival's reputation. Cicero's veering day-to-day judgments of Pompey reveal his inability to see clearly through the distorting medium of his own vanity. But that's Cicero's interpretation, at least. The inflated eulogies of Pompey in Cicero's speeches are punctuated by his persistent sniping at him in his letters, which we'll be looking at in some detail later on. Yet he looked up to him for leadership, Cicero did, and in the moment of decision joined him. But Pompey was neither a revolutionary nor a reactionary, willing to wreck the fabric of the Commonwealth for the advantage of self or class. He expected a voluntary acceptance of his primacy, but was to discover that the methods he had used to get his commands had permanently alienated the dominant nobility. So year after year, he played this kind of passive role, covertly intriguing or waiting for successive occasions to arise that would force them to accept his leadership. Some thought his waiting game was a kind of strategy. Others thought it was sheer political incompetence. He was an ineffective politician in many respects, not from incapacity for intrigue or ruthless action, but from lack of candor and consistency. At least that's an interpretation. You're welcome to disagree or to come up with your own. As a military leader, Pompey fell somewhat short of real greatness, although by no means, a bad military leader. He wasn't as good as Caesar, but he was a decent military leader. He was circumspect and thorough. He was a very able administrator, judging by his organization of the East. His vision of empire was probably no narrower than Caesar's was. He was satisfied with the ideal of efficient and clean-handed administration and justice. And, many of his contemporaries believe that he went far to achieve that aim in his own province. Pompey, the wealthiest man of his age, invested his millions prudently. His landed estates were distributed throughout Italy in manageable units. For all his extravagance and his triumphal shows, and arguably his inexcusable heartlessness as well of the contest in slaughter that he would put on. He was actually a plain living man. He admired Stoic philosophy. We'll look at some of the contests that he puts on a bit later as well, involving killing elephants, amongst other things, in his amphitheater. His third wife, Mucia, bore him 2 sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, and a daughter named Pompeia, before he divorced Mucia for infidelity. Julia was the wife that he loved most dearly, though she dies along with a child. She dies in childbirth along with a child at the time as well. That was what caused, of course, the split. Partly was the cause of the split between him and Caesar. It wasn't the only factor, but it was one. Cornelia was his last wife. She outlived him and mourned his death. We'll leave it there and let you all make your own judgments about Pompey Magnus. I'll show a picture now of his amphitheater and portico put up during the height of his power in Rome. Ta-da! There we go. And we'll think about those things for those of us that are in the seminar. As I say, Pompey is one who could have theoretically been an emperor of Rome. He could have been the first emperor. I don't think that was his intention. I don't think he would have accepted it if he had been offered it. I don't know, but he seems to have stayed a Republican at heart. But we are entering into a period increasingly where extraordinary individuals like Pompey will take the state to the brink, and resulting in a civil war, and it's not over yet. So we'll look at that some more next time. Until then, thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Ta-ta for now.